The Mystery of the Christmas Candle. A Hercule Poirot * Part 1. A flicker in the drawing room. Christmas Eve had wrapped Belvoir Manor in warmth and candlelight. The air carried soft carols, the crackle of firewood, and the faint scent of pine from the towering Christmas tree. Guests laughed, glasses chimed, and peace seemed complete. Then a scream. It came from the drawing room. When everyone rushed in, they found Sir Lionel Ashcroft, the cheerful host of the evening, collapsed beside the mantel. He was lifeless. No blood, no visible wound, just silence. What caught Hercule Poirot's eye, however, was not the body, but the candle. A single Christmas candle burned beside Sir Lionel's hand, its flame glowing an unnatural blue. Wax dripped slowly, like frozen tears. Poirot adjusted his mustache and leaned closer, his sharp eyes narrowing. "A candle," he murmured softly, "should burn yellow. When it burns blue, mon ami, it is trying to tell us something." Outside, snow began to fall. And inside Belvoir Manor, a Christmas mystery was born. Agar Chaho 2, shorter TikTok style Part 1 Ziada Suspense, horror tone roman. Urdu version Bi Benedita Hundat Part 1 5,000 words. Thikai. Ya Part 1 KO main full cinematic. Agatha Christie inspired style main Lik Raha Hun. 5,000 words Kander, Ek detailed opening chapter Ketor Par. The Surf Part 1 Hoga, mystery ka setup, atmosphere, characters, or first shock. Part 1. A flicker in the drawing room. Christmas Eve had arrived at Belvoir Manor with the quiet confidence of tradition. The great house standing dignified on a low hill overlooking frost-laced fields had celebrated Christmas uninterrupted for more than a century. Its stone walls had witnessed births, weddings, reconciliations, and though rarely spoken of deaths. Tonight, however, Belvoir Manor glowed as though determined to forget its darker memories. Snow had begun to fall just before dusk, light and unhurried, settling gently on the bare branches of the chestnut trees lining the long gravel drive. Lanterns hung from iron posts cast golden halos into the evening mist, guiding arriving guests toward the entrance. Inside, the house was alive. The drawing room, the pride of Sir Lionel Ashcroft, was transformed into a sanctuary of warmth and elegance. A towering Christmas tree stood near the bay window, adorned with glass ornaments collected from across Europe, delicate Czech stars, hand-painted French angels, and small silver bells from Vienna. Candlelight shimmered across polished wood and framed portraits of stern ancestors who seemed to watch the festivities with mild disapproval. The fireplace roared cheerfully, sending waves of heat across Persian rugs. Above it hung a wreath of holly and ivy, tied with a velvet ribbon. On the mantelpiece stood a row of candles tall, cream-colored, and faintly scented with honey. It was here, amid comfort and civility, that Hercule Poirot stood observing. He had arrived earlier that afternoon, invited by Sir Lionel himself ostensibly for companionship, though Poirot suspected the true reason lay in Sir Lionel's fondness for displaying interesting people alongside his prized antiques. The Belgian detective, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, despite the holiday informality, surveyed the room with an expression of mild curiosity. Poirot had always found Christmas fascinating. It was a season of deliberate cheer, of people insisting upon harmony while hiding resentments beneath smiles. A time when families gathered not because they wished to, but because tradition demanded it. To Poirot's little gray cells, Christmas was fertile ground. Sir Lionel Ashcroft, the master of Belvoir Manor, was in splendid spirits. A man in his early 60s, Sir Lionel possessed a booming laugh and the air of one who enjoyed both wealth and the appearance of generosity. His silver hair was brushed neatly back, and his waistcoat decorated with a discreet gold watch chain strained slightly against a lifetime of indulgence. "Poirot, my dear fellow," he called, crossing the room with a glass of mulled wine. "You must try this. My housekeeper insists her recipe is unrivaled." Poirot accepted the glass with a polite nod. "Madame Finch is a woman of great precision," Poirot replied. "Such people rarely exaggerate." Sir Lionel chuckled. "You see, that's why I invited you. You notice things others overlook." Poirot smiled faintly but said nothing. Around them, guests mingled in small clusters. Lady Eleanor Ashcroft, Sir Lionel's wife, sat near the fire, elegant and composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was a woman of poise rather than warmth, her beauty refined and distant, as though carefully preserved. Her eyes moved frequently around the room, noting details, watching people. Nearby stood Edward Ashcroft, Sir Lionel's stepson, a tall man in his early 30s with sharp features and a restlessness that betrayed impatience. He leaned against a bookshelf, nursing a drink, his jaw tightening whenever his stepfather laughed too loudly. At the far end of the room, Margaret Vale, Sir Lionel's niece, examined the ornaments on the tree with exaggerated interest. She was pale and nervous, her fingers fidgeting with the ribbon on a small gift box. And near the window stood Mr. Jonathan Hall, a guest of recent acquaintance. A chemist by profession, Hawley was thin, reserved, and observant. He spoke little, but when he did, it was with careful precision. Music drifted faintly from the adjoining salon where a gramophone played a carol at low volume. For a moment, the scene felt timeless, unchanging. Poirot's gaze lingered on the candles atop the mantelpiece. They were handsome things, tall and smooth, their flames steady and calm. Yet something about them unsettled him. He could not have said why, at first only that his instinct stirred. Time passed. Drinks were refreshed. Laughter rose and fell. Sir Lionel regaled his guests with stories of his travels and acquisitions, embellishing freely. Then, at precisely 20 minutes past 9, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible tightening of the air. Poirot noticed it when the fire crackled unusually loud. Or perhaps it was when one of the candles flickered, its flame briefly elongating before settling again. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. At that same moment, Sir Lionel excused himself and stepped closer to the mantel. "These candles," he said jovially, gesturing toward them, "are rather special. Beeswax, imported, finest quality." He leaned in, examining one flame closely. Poirot opened his mouth to speak, to warn, he did not know, and then came the scream. It was sharp, sudden, and filled with pure terror. Lady Ashcroft was the first to turn. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Edward straightened abruptly, spilling his drink. Sir Lionel staggered backward. For a heartbeat, no one understood what they were seeing. Then Sir Lionel collapsed. His body struck the rug beside the fireplace with a dull sound. Limbs slack, eyes staring sightlessly upward. The room seemed to freeze around him, as though time itself had drawn in a breath. Poirot moved instantly. He knelt beside Sir Lionel, his expression calm but focused. A quick glance told him there was no blood, no sign of violence. Sir Lionel's face had taken on an unnatural stillness. "He is dead," Poirot said quietly. Panic erupted. Lady Ashcroft rose, gripping the arm of her chair. Margaret began to sob softly. Edward swore under his breath. Mr. Hawley stood rigid, his face pale. Poirot remained kneeling, his eyes drifting, not to the body, but to the candle. One candle, positioned closest to where Sir Lionel had stood, burned differently from the others. Its flame was not yellow, it was blue. A thin, steady blue that shimmered unnaturally against the warm glow of the room. Poirot felt a chill run through him. He rose slowly, approaching the mantel. The wax dripped in slow, deliberate trails, like tears frozen in motion. The scent was faintly altered, sharp, metallic. "A candle," Poirot murmured, almost to himself, "that burns blue does not burn honestly." No one spoke. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing Belvoir Manor in silence. And within, the drawing room, beneath the glow of Christmas light, a murder had announced itself, not with blood or struggle, but with fire. Poirot straightened, his expression grave. "This," he said softly, "is only the beginning." Part 2. The unlikely victim. For several seconds after Poirot pronounced the words, "He is dead," no one moved. It was as though the drawing room itself refused to accept the truth. The fire continued to burn. The gramophone, forgotten in the adjoining salon, played the final wavering notes of a carol before falling silent. The blue flame of the candle flickered gently, indifferent to human shock. Lady Eleanor Ashcroft was the first to react. "No," she said softly, rising from her chair. "That is not possible." Her voice was steady, almost composed, yet her fingers trembled as they pressed against the mantel for support. She looked down at her husband's body, her expression unreadable. Margaret Vale let out a strangled sob. "Oh God, Uncle Lionel." She took a step forward, then stopped, as if afraid the floor itself might give way beneath her. Edward Ashcroft stared at the body with narrowed eyes. His face had drained of color, but something else flickered there too. Calculation, perhaps, or disbelief mixed with something darker. "This is madness," he muttered. He was talking a moment ago. Mr. Jonathan Halley said nothing. He stood near the window, perfectly still, his hands clenched at his sides. His gaze was fixed not on Sir Lionel, but on the candle. Poirot noticed. Always he noticed. "Madame," Poirot said gently to Lady Ashcroft, "may I ask that no one touch anything? It is important." Lady Ashcroft nodded once. "Of course, you are certain?" Poirot inclined his head. "Quite." He returned his attention to Sir Lionel's body. Kneeling again, he examined him carefully, his movements precise, respectful. There were no visible injuries. No discoloration around the lips. No scent of almonds, no overturned glass, no spilled drink. Sir Lionel looked, as Poirot would later remark, inconveniently peaceful. "A man who dies violently," Poirot said, more to himself than to the room, "usually tells us so." Edward scoffed. "Are you saying he wasn't murdered?" Poirot glanced up. "On the contrary, monsieur, I am saying the murderer was considerate." This earned him a sharp look. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself. "What do you mean?" Poirot rose slowly and dusted his knees. "I mean," he said, "that whoever caused Sir Lionel's death wished it to appear sudden, natural, almost polite. No mess, no noise, no struggle." Lady Ashcroft closed her eyes briefly. Lionel had no enemies, she said quietly. Poirot did not respond at once. Instead, he walked to the mantel and gestured toward the candles. "Tell me," he said, "were these lit earlier this evening?" Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, who had arrived breathless at the doorway, nodded quickly. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. I lit them myself before dinner." "And they burned normally?" "Of course." Poirot leaned closer to the nearest candle, the blue-flamed one. He did not touch it. He simply observed. Sir Lionel was known for his robust health, yes? Poirot asked. "Extremely," Edward replied. "The man never slowed down. No heart troubles?" "No fainting?" "None." Poirot nodded. "Then his death is inconvenient." Margaret looked confused. "Inconvenient?" "Yes, for someone who wished to avoid suspicion." A shiver passed through the room. Poirot turned toward Lady Ashcroft. "Madame, would you permit me to ask a difficult question?" She straightened. "Please, when did you last speak to your husband privately?" Lady Ashcroft hesitated only a moment. "Earlier this afternoon." "About household matters." Edward let out a short laugh. "Household matters. That's one way of putting it." Lady Ashcroft's gaze hardened. Edward Poirot raised a hand. "Later, monsieur, all later." He turned next to Margaret. "And you, mademoiselle?" Margaret swallowed. "Before dinner. He gave me a gift." Poirot's eyes softened. "Was he kind?" "Yes," she said quickly. "He was always kind to me." Poirot nodded and turned at last to Mr. Hawley. "And you, monsieur?" Hawley blinked, as if startled. I spoke with Sir Lionel briefly in the library. About business." What business? Chemistry, Halley said carefully. Patents. Old matters. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Old matters, he repeated. The silence that followed was thick. Poirot stepped back and surveyed the room as a whole. The fire, the tree, the guests, the candle still burning its strange blue flame. This was not a crime of passion, Poirot said calmly. It was not committed in anger. It required preparation, knowledge, and patience. Edward folded his arms. Are you accusing one of us? Poirot smiled faintly. Non, I am accusing the situation. Lady Ashcroft took a steadying breath. What happens now? Poirot glanced toward the window, where snow continued to fall, sealing the manor off from the world. Now, he said, we wait for the police, and we think. He moved closer to the candle once more. And while we wait, he added softly, I would advise no one to light another. The blue flame wavered dot, and in its unearthly glow, each face in the room seemed suddenly less certain, less innocent than before. Asterisk. Part 3. A house of secrets. The arrival of the police was delayed by the snow. That fact alone changed everything. Belvoir Manor, normally a place of comfort and ceremony, became an island cut off from the world by white silence. Telephone lines crackled uselessly. The long gravel drive was already buried beneath drifting snow, and the nearest village lay miles away. Poirot understood at once what this meant. No one would leave. No one would arrive. And the truth would have nowhere to hide. Lady Ashcroft insisted that Sir Lionel's body be moved only after proper authority arrived. So he remained where he had fallen, respectfully covered with a woolen throw. The drawing room, however, was no longer fit for company. One by one, the guests withdrew into the adjoining library. As though distance might soften reality, Poirot lingered behind for a moment. He extinguished the blue-flamed candle himself. As the flame died, it released a faint, acrid scent sharp enough to confirm his unease. Poirot's mustache twitched. Yes, he murmured, very clever. The library was colder, darker, and more intimate. Floor-to-ceiling shelves loomed. Over leather chairs and a large oak table strewn with unopened Christmas cards. A single lamp cast a yellow pool of light, leaving the corners in shadow. It was here that Poirot began his work. Madame, messieurs, he said gently, until the police arrive, we must rely on order. Please sit. Reluctantly, they did. Lady Ashcroft chose the high-backed chair near the fire, composed once more, though her knuckles were pale. Edward remained standing, restless, pacing near the shelves. Margaret sat close to the table, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. Mr. Halley positioned himself slightly apart, as though habit demanded distance. Mrs. Finch hovered near the doorway, clearly wishing to disappear. Poirot folded his hands. This house, he said calmly, has many rooms and many histories. Tonight, one of them has ended very badly. Edward stopped pacing. You talk as if you're certain one of us did it. Poirot smiled faintly. In a house sealed by snow, monsieur, certainty comes easily, Margaret gasped. You don't mean... Poirot raised a finger. I mean only this. Sir Lionel did not die by accident. He did not die naturally. Therefore, someone here is connected to his death. Silence followed. Poirot turned first to Mrs. Finch. You have served Sir Lionel for many years, yes? 22, she replied quickly. Since before his second marriage. And tonight, what did you notice? She hesitated. Nothing unusual, sir. Everything was as it should be. Poirot nodded. People who say that usually notice something. Mrs. Finch swallowed. He seemed pleased. More than usual. About what? I couldn't say. Poirot let it rest. He turned next to Edward. You are his stepson. You did not inherit the manor. Edward's jaw tightened. Is that a question or an accusation? An observation. Edward exhaled sharply. He promised I'd be taken care of. That's all. And were you satisfied with promises? Edward looked away. Poirot made a small note in his mind. He faced Margaret. "You were fond of your uncle?" "Yes," she whispered. "Very. And yet you were nervous all evening." She flushed. "I don't like crowds." Poirot regarded her gently. "Nor do you like secrets." Tears welled in her eyes, but she said nothing. Finally, Poirot turned to Mr. Halley. "You are a man of science," Poirot said. "Order, precision, patience." Halley nodded stiffly. "Yes." "And you spoke with Sir Lionel privately today, briefly." "About chemistry." Hale's fingers tightened. "Yes." Poirot leaned forward. "Then you will understand this," he said softly. "A blue flame does not happen by chance." Hale's eyes flickered, just for a second. Poirot saw it dot at that moment. Lady Ashcroft rose. "This is enough," she said coolly. "My husband is dead, and you interrogate us like criminals." Poirot inclined his head. "Madame, grief and guilt often wear similar masks." Her expression hardened. "Are you suggesting—" "I suggest nothing," Poirot replied. "I observe." A clock chimed softly somewhere in the house. Poirot straightened. "There's something else," he said. Sir Lionel was not the intended audience of the crime. Everyone stared at him. "What do you mean?" Edward demanded. Poirot gestured toward the library shelves. "A candle is a patient weapon. It waits. It requires someone to lean close." "To admire," Margaret whispered. "He loved his candles." "Precisely." Poirot's voice lowered. "This crime relied on habit." A shudder passed through the room. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "Belvoir Manor," he said quietly, "is a house of tradition. But tradition creates patterns, and patterns create opportunity." Snow pressed harder against the windows dot and within the walls of the manor. Every person present began to wonder the same thing. Who had known Sir Lionel well enough to plan his death and hide it inside a Christmas candle? Part 4. The candle examined, the night deepened. Beyond the tall windows of Belvoir Manor, snow pressed steadily against the glass, muting the world into a white hush. Inside the library, the air felt heavier now, thick with suspicion and unspoken thoughts. The fire burned low, casting long, wavering shadows across the bookshelves, shadows that seemed to stretch and listen. Hercule Poirot stood apart from the others, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind already far ahead of the moment. "The candle," he said at last. All eyes turned to him. Lady Ashcroft stiffened. "What about it?" "It is," Poirot replied calmly, "the most important witness in this house." Edward let out a sharp breath. "It's just a candle." Poirot turned his head slowly. "Ah, that is what the murderer hoped you would think." He moved toward the drawing-room door. After a moment's hesitation, the others followed. The drawing-room felt different, now emptier, colder. Sir Lionel's body lay covered near the hearth, a silent reminder that celebration had ended here forever. Poirot approached the mantelpiece where the remaining candles stood unlit. "The one that burned blue," Poirot said, "has already told us a great deal. Now it must tell us more." Mrs. Finch fetched a small tray and gloves at Poirot's request. With careful precision, he lifted the candle and examined it under the lamplight. "It is beeswax," he said. "Excellent quality." "Expensive, chosen deliberately," Margaret frowned. "Why does that matter?" "Because," Poirot replied, "cheap wax burns unevenly. This candle was designed to burn predictably." He rotated it slowly. At first glance, it appeared flawless. Smooth sides, perfect symmetry, but Poirot's eyes lingered at the base. He bent closer. "There," he murmured. Edward leaned in. "I don't see anything." Poirot smiled faintly. "You are not meant to." Using the edge of a paper knife, he gently scraped away a thin layer of wax near the bottom. Beneath it, barely visible, was a faint circular seam. This candle, Poirot said quietly, was opened and closed again. A chill ran through the room. Lady Ashcroft pressed a hand to her mouth. "You mean it was tampered with?" We. Poirot straightened and looked around. To do this requires patience, skill, and most importantly knowledge of heat. His gaze drifted, almost casually, toward Mr. Jonathan Hawley. Hawley felt it immediately. You can't be serious. Poirot did not answer him yet. Instead, he continued his examination. Notice also the flame's color, Poirot said. Blue flames are produced by certain chemical salts, copper, most commonly. Margaret whispered, so someone added chemicals to the wax? Yes, but chemicals alone do not kill. Edward folded his arms. Then what did? Poirot paused. Heat, he said. Time and proximity. He carefully placed the candle back on the tray. This candle was hollowed, Poirot explained. Inside it, something was hidden, something that remained harmless until the wax burned down to a certain point. Lady Ashcroft's voice trembled. Poison? Poirot nodded slowly. Most likely. The words seemed to echo in the room, but there was no smell, Edward protested. No reaction. Poirot looked at him sharply. Because you were thinking of poison as a liquid or powder. This was neither. He turned again to Mr. Hawley. A volatile compound, Poirot said gently. One that becomes deadly when heated. Hale's face had gone pale. That's speculation, is it? Poirot asked softly. You are a chemist. You know how such substances behave. Silence answered him. Poirot continued. When Sir Lionel leaned close to admire the candle, as he often did, the heat reached the hidden chamber. The seal broke. The poison vaporized. Margaret gasped. And he breathed it in. Yes, Poirot said. A breath or two was enough. Lady Ashcroft sank into a chair. Edward's voice was harsh. You're saying someone turned a Christmas candle into a weapon? Poirot inclined his head. A very elegant one. Mrs. Finch crossed herself. Who would do such a thing? Poirot looked around the room, his eyes thoughtful. Someone who knew Sir Lionel's habits, he said. Someone who knew candles, someone who knew chemistry. His gaze lingered again on Hale long enough to be unmistakable. Hawley clenched his fists. This is absurd. Many people know about chemicals. True, Poirot said calmly. But fewer know how to hide them so neatly inside wax. The fire cracked suddenly, making Margaret flinch. Poirot stepped back from the mantel. One more thing, he added. This was not a crime committed in haste. The candle had to burn for a specific length of time. The murderer had to trust that Sir Lionel would stand in exactly the right place. Edward frowned. That's a risk. Poirot smiled thinly. Not if you know your victim very well. The snow outside thickened, blurring the world beyond the windows. Poirot folded his hands. The candle, he said, has spoken. Now it is the people who must speak. And in the uneasy silence that followed, one truth became impossible. To ignore. Sir Lionel Ashcroft's death had been planned long before. Christmas Eve, and someone in Belvoir Manor had waited patiently for the flame to burn low enough to kill. Part 5. Alibis that melt. The discovery had changed the temperature of the room. What had once been grief and confusion hardened now into fear sharpened by certainty. Sir Lionel Ashcroft had not died by chance. He had been engineered to die. With care and intelligence, and the instrument of his death had sat openly among them, glowing politely in candlelight. Hercule Poirot felt it immediately, the moment when people stop mourning and begin calculating. Now, he said gently, we must speak of where each of you was and why, Edward scoffed. You already think you know who did it. Poirot's mustache twitched. Non, monsieur, I only know that lies behave like wax. Under heat, they lose their shape. No one laughed. Poirot gestured toward the chairs. Please, sit. Alibis are best examined when people are still. Reluctantly, they obeyed. Lady Ashcroft Poirot turned first to Sir Lionel's widow. Madame, he said, at the time your husband collapsed, where were you? Lady Ashcroft met his gaze steadily. Here, by the fire, I was watching him. You did not approach the candles? No. Did you notice the flame change color? A pause brief, but present. Yes, she said at last. But I assumed it was a trick of the light. Poirot nodded. You did not cry out until he fell. Her lips tightened. I did not want to cause panic. Edward laughed bitterly. You never do. She ignored him. Poirot made a small note in his mind. Composure under shock. Not guilt, yet but practiced. Edward Ashcroft. Your turn, monsieur. Edward leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. I was by the shelves. I'd been there for at least 10 minutes. Anyone with you? No. Poirot smiled faintly. How unfortunate. Edward bristled. You think I killed him? I had every reason to want him alive. Did you? Poirot asked softly. Edward hesitated. Just long enough. Poirot pressed on. You expected something from Sir Lionel. My inheritance. And had you received assurances? Edward's jaw tightened. Only words, words again. Poirot nodded. Thank you. Margaret Vale. Poirot's voice softened when he turned to Margaret. And you, mademoiselle? She clasped her hands tightly. I was near the tree. I never left the room. Did you touch the candles? No, never. Poirot studied her trembling fingers. You were afraid all evening. She swallowed. I don't like conflict. Or confrontation, Poirot said gently. You prefer silence. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I loved my uncle. Poirot believed her, which troubled him. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, wrung her hands nervously. I was in the pantry when it happened, preparing coffee. Alone? Yes, sir. Did you notice anything unusual earlier? She hesitated. Mr. Hawley asked about the candles. Every head turned. Hawley stiffened. I admired them. That's all. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Did you touch them, monsieur? No. Did you handle them at any point? No, Hawley said firmly. I wouldn't dare. Poirot let the silence stretch out. Mr. Jonathan Hale at last. Poirot faced him fully. And you, monsieur? Where were you when Sir Lionel fell? Hawley swallowed. Near the window, watching the snow. Alone? Yes. Poirot nodded slowly. You spoke with Sir Lionel earlier about old matters. Yes, matters that ended badly for you. Hale's eyes flashed. That is irrelevant. Poirot leaned forward. Revenge, he said calmly, is never irrelevant. Hawley rose to his feet. This is outrageous. You're building a story, not evidence. Poirot smiled thinly. No, monsieur, I am watching pressure. He gestured toward the extinguished candle. Each of you had opportunity. But opportunity alone does not kill. Edward snapped. Then what does? Poirot straightened. Knowledge, he said. Patience. An emotional restraint. Lady Ashcroft's fingers tightened around her handkerchief. Poirot continued. One more thing troubles me. The candle had to be lit by someone, but not the murderer. Margaret looked up. What do you mean? Poirot's voice dropped. The murderer prepared the weapon, then trusted another to activate it. A collective chill passed through the room. Poirot looked at Mrs. Finch. You lit the candles, she gasped. I would never, I know, Poirot said gently. That is what makes it clever. He stepped back, surveying them all. Your alibis, he said, do not contradict one another. Edward frowned. Isn't that good? Poirot shook his head. No, he said quietly. It means the truth is hiding between them. The fire popped sharply outside. The snow showed no sign of stopping, and inside Belvoir Manor, Poirot felt the case tightening like wax melting, dripping slowly toward a revelation none of them were ready to face. Part 6. The Locked Room. Illusion morning crept into Belvoir Manor reluctantly, as though the sun itself hesitated to intrude upon what had happened there. The snow had not stopped. It lay thick against the windows, sealing the house in a white silence that pressed upon every room. Poirot had not slept. He stood now in the drawing room, alone except for the covered form beside the hearth. The candles remained where they had been, unlit and accusing. He studied the door, solid oak, heavy, respectable. Respectable things, Poirot knew, were often deceptive. When the others entered at his request, they found him waiting calmly, hands folded, expression unreadable. "Madame, messieurs," he said, "we must now speak of something you all believe you understand." Edward frowned. "And what's that?" Poirot gestured toward the door. "This room." Lady Ashcroft stiffened. "What about it?" "You believe," Poirot continued, "that Sir Lionel died in a room that was effectively sealed. No stranger entered. No one fled." Margaret nodded. "That's true, isn't it?" Poirot smiled faintly. "It is almost true." He crossed to the door and closed it carefully. "Mrs. Finch," he said, "you locked this door last night after the body was discovered, yes?" "Yes, Monsieur Poirot." "And the key?" "In the lock. On the inside." Poirot nodded. "A locked room." "Very reassuring." Edward folded his arms. "So?" "So," Poirot said softly, "locked rooms comfort us because they suggest impossibility." He reached into his pocket and withdrew something thin and metallic, a hairpin. Margaret gasped. "Where did you get that?" Poirot smiled. "From the floor. Near the library door." Hawley shifted uneasily. Poirot crouched beside the keyhole. "Observe," he said. "This lock is old, reliable, but not clever. With careful precision." He slid the pin into the keyhole, twisted, and gently turned the key from the inside. Click. The door unlocked. Silence fell over the room. Poirot straightened and removed the pin. "Once the door is locked," he explained calmly, "the tool is withdrawn. The illusion is complete." Edward stared. "You're saying anyone could have locked it from outside?" "Anyone with patience," Poirot corrected. Lady Ashcroft's voice was tight. "But no one left the room before the scream." Poirot inclined his head. "Exactly." He moved toward the mantel. "The murderer did not need to leave," he said. "The crime was finished before anyone realized it had begun." Margaret whispered, "Then the locked door means nothing." Poirot nodded. "It means comfort. Nothing more." He turned, his gaze sweeping the group. "This is why the candle was chosen. No movement. No struggle. No suspicious exit." Hawley spoke suddenly. "You're building tricks on top of tricks." Poirot looked at him sharply. "No, monsieur. I am removing them." Poirot approached Sir Lionel's body. "There is something else," he said quietly. "Something none of you questioned," Edward frowned. "What?" Poirot's voice dropped. "Why Sir Lionel stood there." The room seemed to shrink. He could have admired the candles from anywhere. Poirot continued. Yet he leaned close to the one candle that had been altered. Margaret looked stricken. "You think he was drawn there?" "Yes." Poirot turned back to the mantel and picked up a small object, a silver ornament shaped like an angel. "This," he said, "was missing from the tree earlier." Mrs. Finch gasped. "It was Sir Lionel's favorite." Poirot nodded. "It was placed beside the candle." "A small detail. A temptation." Lady Ashcroft's eyes widened. "He always rearranged things," she whispered. Poirot's gaze hardened. The murderer understood this habit perfectly. He placed the ornament down. "This was not a trap sprung in panic," Poirot said. "It was a performance. The locked room was merely the final applause." Edward ran a hand through his hair. "Then whoever did this knew him intimately." Poirot met his eyes. "Yes." Silence pressed in again, heavier now. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. "We are very close," he said softly. "So close that the murderer is beginning to feel it." His eyes flicked just once toward Jonathan Hall. Hawley noticed. So did everyone else. Outside. The wind howled, rattling the windows like impatient fingers. and within Belvoir Manor. The locked room illusion had collapsed, leaving behind something far more dangerous than mystery. Truth with nowhere left to hide. Part 7. Wax and Poison. By late afternoon, the storm worsened. Snow fell now in thick, heavy sheets, blotting out the horizon and turning Belvoir Manor into a white-bound fortress. The police were still hours away, perhaps longer. Time, Poirot knew, was no longer neutral. It was beginning to favor the murderer. Poirot requested the use of the servants' workroom, a narrow chamber adjoining the kitchen where tools were kept. The others gathered reluctantly, drawn by the same grim curiosity that had followed each revelation. So far, on the table lay the candle. Unlit, innocent in appearance, deadly in truth. Poirot donned gloves once more. "Madame, messieurs," he said quietly, "we now move from theory to certainty." Edward crossed his arms. "You already have certainty." Poirot shook his head. "None. I have structure. Certainty requires proof." He picked up a small knife, thin, sharp, precise. "This candle," Poirot continued, "was not merely altered. It was engineered." He pressed the blade carefully into the base, exactly where the faint seam lay hidden beneath layers of wax. With slow, deliberate movements, he cut away a circular section. Margaret turned away, unable to watch. A hollow cavity was revealed. Inside it sat a tiny glass ampule, no larger than a finger joint. Sealed and intact, a collective breath was drawn. Lady Ashcroft whispered, "My God." Poirot lifted the ampule gently with tweezers and held it up to the light. Inside sloshed a clear, colorless liquid. "This," Poirot said, "is the heart of the crime." Edward frowned. "That doesn't look like poison." Poirot smiled faintly. "That is because poison does not always wish to be seen." He turned to Jonathan Hawley. "You recognize it, don't you?" Hale's jaw tightened. "I recognize glass." Poirot inclined his head. "Then allow me to explain for those less educated in chemistry." He placed the ampule carefully on the table. "This substance," Poirot said, "is harmless at room temperature. But when heated, it vaporizes rapidly. The vapor is colorless, odorless, and lethal when inhaled in even small quantities." Margaret's voice trembled. "What does it do?" Poirot's expression darkened. "It stops the heart," he said simply. Quietly, Lady Ashcroft sank into a chair. Edward looked sick. "You're saying he never stood a chance?" "No," Poirot replied. "Sir Lionel died the moment he leaned close enough." The room fell silent again. Poirot continued. The ampule was placed inside the candle at a calculated height. Not too high, otherwise it would never heat. Not too low, otherwise it would rupture too early. He looked around the room. This required testing. Edward snapped. "You're saying someone practiced killing him?" Poirot met his gaze. "Yes." Margaret covered her mouth, horrified. Poirot turned back to Hawley. "Such a substance," Poirot said, "is not common. It requires access, knowledge, and most importantly confidence that one understands heat transfer." Hawley laughed sharply, but there was no humor in it. "Circumstantial." Poirot leaned forward. "You asked Mrs. Finch about the candles," Poirot said. "You admired them. You inspected them." "I like craftsmanship," Hawley replied quickly. "And you discussed old patents with Sir Lionel," Poirot continued. "Patents involving volatile compounds." Hale's eyes flashed. "He stole my work." Lady Ashcroft looked up sharply. "What?" Hawley realized too late what he had said. Poirot's voice was calm. "Ah, now we arrive." Edward stared at Hawley. "What is he talking about?" Poirot answered for him. "Years ago," Poirot said, "Sir Lionel exposed a patent as fraudulent. The patent belonged to Mr. Hawley." Hale's fists clenched. "He ruined me." Poirot nodded. "And yet he invited you here." "To Christmas," Margaret whispered. "Why would he do that?" Poirot's gaze sharpened. Because Sir Lionel enjoyed control, he said. He believed old wounds had healed. Hale's composure cracked. You have no proof I put that ampule there. Poirot straightened. No, he said quietly. But the wax does. He gestured to the candle. The base shows signs of reheating. The wax was softened and reformed recently. Only someone comfortable working with heat would attempt such a repair without visible damage. Hale backed away slightly. Poirot pressed on, and one more thing. The poison could not have been released unless Sir Lionel leaned close. The murderer knew he would. Edward swallowed. Because he always did. Poirot nodded. This was not an impulsive act, he said. It was personal. It was precise. Hale's breathing quickened. Outside the wind howled louder, rattling the shutters violently. Poirot folded his hands. The science, he said gently, is complete. What remains is the human reason. He looked directly at Hale, and that, monsieur, is far more dangerous. Hale's face had gone white. The candle lay open on the table between them, a dissected symbol of patience, intellect, and cold intent. And for the first time since Sir Lionel's death, everyone in the room understood something terrible and unavoidable. The murderer was no longer hiding behind mystery. He was hiding behind motive. Part 8. Motive revealed. The room felt smaller now, not because of the walls, but because the truth had begun to press inward, squeezing the air from every corner. The candle, once a symbol of warmth and celebration, lay dissected on the table, its secret exposed. No one looked at it anymore. All eyes had turned to Jonathan Hall. Hale stood rigid, his back straight, his face pale but controlled. Too controlled. Poirot observed him quietly, as a physician might observe a patient who insists he is not ill. Monsieur Hale, Poirot said at last, you are a clever man. Clever men rarely commit foolish crimes. They commit justified ones. Hale let out a short, bitter laugh. Justified murder? Is that your conclusion? Poirot shook his head. Non, that is your conclusion. Edward stepped forward. You said he ruined you. What did you mean? Hale hesitated. Asterisk. Lady Ashcroft spoke first. Jonathan, Lionel told me once about a chemist. A man who tried to pass dangerous work as safe. Hale's eyes snapped to her. He exaggerated. Poirot raised a finger. Exaggeration does not destroy a career, monsieur. Evidence does. The silence that followed was heavy. Expectant. Hale's shoulders sagged slightly. Years ago, he said slowly, I developed a compound, efficient, powerful, too powerful. Perhaps but promising. Poirot nodded. And Sir Lionel, an investor and collector of innovations, took an interest. He offered funding, Hale continued. Then he exposed a flaw publicly. Claimed I had hidden risks. Edward frowned. Had you? Hale's jaw tightened. Every discovery has risks. Poirot said nothing. They stripped me of my license, Hale went on. My reputation. My future. Sir Lionel walked away untouched. Margaret whispered, but why now? Hale laughed again, this time hollow. Because he invited me here. As though nothing had happened. As though I should be grateful. Poirot leaned forward. And you accepted? Yes, Hale snapped. Because I wanted him to look at me, just once, and understand. Poirot's voice was gentle now. Understand what, monsieur? Hale's composure finally cracked. That I remembered. The words fell like stones. Lady Ashcroft closed her eyes. Poirot spoke quietly. Revenge is rarely loud. It prefers patience. Hale's hands trembled. You think I wanted him dead immediately? No, I wanted him comfortable, confident. Poirot nodded. That is why you chose Christmas. The realization rippled through the room. A season of forgiveness, Poirot continued. Of lowered defenses. Of habits repeated without thought. Edward stared at Hawley. You planned this for months. Hawley did not deny it. Poirot pressed on. You studied his routines. His fondness for candles. His habit of rearranging ornaments. Hale's voice dropped. He always leaned in. Always admired the flame. Poirot's eyes were sad. And you placed temptation beside it. The silver angel. Margaret shuddered. He trusted you. Yes, Hawley said quietly. That was necessary. Poirot straightened. You did not hate Sir Lionel, he said. Not in the way angry men hate. You hated the power he held over your life. Hawley looked at him sharply. Is there a difference? Poirot answered softly. There is always a difference. The wind outside slammed against the manor, rattling the windows violently. It felt like the house itself was listening. Edward spoke hoarsely. Then why didn't you just poison him directly? Hawley met his gaze. Because I wanted no hand on him. No trace. I wanted the world to believe he simply stopped. Poirot nodded. A death without drama. Like your career. That landed. Hale's breath caught. Poirot took a step closer. You did not light the candle, Poirot said. You let an innocent woman do it. You trusted time. Hawley whispered. I trusted science. Poirot's voice hardened. Science does not absolve intention. Sir Lionel's covered form seemed suddenly heavier in the room. Poirot folded his hands. Monsieur Hawley, he said. You are not a monster. That is why this crime succeeded. Hawley looked at him, eyes glistening. And that is why it had to. The silence that followed was not relief, but inevitability. Poirot turned away. The police will arrive soon, he said. Your motive is now as clear as your method. Hawley sank into a chair. The candle, broken and exposed, lay between them like a confession that no one had wanted to hear. And though no handcuffs had yet closed around Jonathan Hale's wrists, everyone in Belvoir Manor understood the truth. The mystery was no longer about how Sir Lionel died. It was about whether the murderer could live with what he had done. Part 9. The Christmas Arrest. The sound arrived before the sight. A distant crunch tires, struggling through packed snow, followed by the low growl of an engine fighting the cold. Every head in Belvoir Manor turned toward the windows. They're here, Edward said quietly. Relief moved through the house, thin and uncertain, like warmth returning to frozen fingers. For Poirot, it brought something else, finality. Moments later, the front door opened, letting in a rush of icy air and two uniformed figures stamped white with snow. Behind them came Inspector Clark, tall, broad-shouldered, his coat heavy with sleet and his expression already weary. Terrible weather, Clark muttered. Then he took in the room, the tension, the drawn faces, the covered body. His tone changed instantly. I take it we're too late. Poirot stepped forward. Inspector, he said calmly. You arrive at precisely the right moment. Sir Lionel's body was examined first. The doctor accompanying the police worked in silence, then straightened slowly. No signs of violence, he said. But this is no natural death. Poirot gestured toward the table where the candle lay dissected. Allow me, he said. He explained everything, without drama, without haste. The blue flame, the altered wax, the hidden ampule, the vaporized poison. Inspector Clark listened intently, his frown deepening with every detail. And you are certain? Clark asked. Poirot inclined his head. As certain as science allows. The inspector turned toward Jonathan Hawley. You'll come with us. Sir. Hawley did not resist as the constable stepped forward. Lady Ashcroft spoke for the first time since the confrontation. Jonathan, she said quietly, was any of it worth it? Hawley paused. For years, he replied. I replayed the moment he destroyed me. Tonight, I realize it never ended. Poirot watched him closely. You see, Poirot said softly, revenge does not conclude a story. It only extends it. Hawley looked at him, then really looked at him. You understand, Hawley said. Poirot nodded. I understand why. Not why it was right. The constables placed the handcuffs on Hal's wrists. The metallic click echoed louder than it should have. Margaret turned away, tears streaking her face. Edward exhaled shakily. So that's it. Inspector Clark gestured toward the door. We'll need statements from all of you. Poirot moved aside, allowing Hawley to pass. As he did, Hawley spoke once more. You know, he said quietly. The candle worked perfectly. Poirot met his gaze, unwavering. That, he replied, is the most tragic part. Hawley was let out into the snow, his dark coat vanishing into the white storm. The door closed behind him with a final, echoing thud. The house felt different afterward. Lighter but also emptier. Lady Ashcroft sat heavily in her chair. Edward stared into the fire as though seeking something it could not give. Margaret clutched a blanket around her shoulders. Inspector Clark approached Poirot. An unusual case, he said. Elegant, horrifying. Poirot nodded. The most dangerous crimes often are. Clark hesitated. If you hadn't been here. Poirot allowed himself a small, sad smile. Then the candle would have told its story too late. Outside, the snow finally began to ease. The police prepared to leave. Their work nearly done. And as Belvoir Manor settled into the aftermath of truth, one certainty remained. Sir Lionel Ashcroft's Christmas would be remembered not for its warmth, but for the moment when justice arrived. Quiet as falling snow. Part 10. A quiet flame dawn came softly to Belvoir Manor. The storm had spent itself in the night, leaving the world hushed and pale, as though the snow wished to erase what had happened. Light crept through the tall windows of the drawing room, touching the furniture gently, revealing nothing dramatic, only the aftermath of truth. Hercule Poirot stood alone by the mantel. The candles were gone now, removed by the police, extinguished in every sense. In their place lay bare wood, faintly marked where wax had once dripped. Poirot studied this space with quiet attention, as though expecting it to speak again. But some witnesses he knew speak only once. Behind him, a soft footstep sounded. Lady Eleanor Ashcroft entered the room, wrapped in a dark shawl. She looked older in the morning light, less composed, more human. Monsieur Poirot, she said quietly. I wish to thank you. Poirot inclined his head. For the truth, madame? Yes, even when it was cruel. Poirot turned to face her. Truth often is, he replied gently. But it is the only thing that does not change with time. She nodded, her gaze drifting to the hearth. I keep thinking, she said, that if I had noticed something sooner. Poirot raised a hand. Please, guilt is a luxury of hindsight. You did not invite evil into your home. You invited Christmas. Lady Ashcroft's eyes filled with tears. But she did not let them fall. She left him then quietly. As though afraid to disturb the fragile peace, Poirot remained. He reached into his pocket and removed the small silver angel, the one that had lured Sir Lionel to the flame. He turned it over in his palm, studying its serene face. Objects, Poirot murmured, are never innocent. They only reflect us. He placed the angel back on the table. Outside, servants moved carefully through the house, restoring order. Rugs were straightened. Chairs returned to their places. Life, persistent and indifferent, resumed its rhythm. Margaret appeared in the doorway. Uncle Poirot? She asked hesitantly. Poirot smiled at the familiar misuse of his title. Yes, mademoiselle. Will you stay for Christmas dinner? Poirot considered. A house carries memory, he thought. Some are heavier than others, I think, he said kindly. That Belvoir Manor has had enough candles for one Christmas. She smiled sadly. As Poirot prepared to leave later that morning, he paused once more in the drawing room. Sunlight now filled the space fully, washing away shadows. It was just a room again. And yet, Poirot adjusted his mustache. A clever crime, he said softly to the empty room, is still a crime. He stepped outside. The snow crunched beneath his shoes as he made his way down the drive. Behind him, Belvoir Manor stood silent, changed forever, yet still standing. Christmas bells rang faintly from the distant village, and somewhere in the quiet morning, Hercule Poirot allowed himself one small comfort, that even the most patient flame, no matter how carefully hidden, will always eventually burn itself out. The end.